By the time then we get to the 1900s, right, the first generation of individuals who will describe themselves as psychologists, and those whom in retrospect we will, as historians of intellectual life, say here's the first generation of psychologists, they are establishing themselves and making the argument that just as with physics, chemistry, biology, and so forth, it is the turn of psychology to establish itself as a science with its own subject matter and methodology as the other sciences had done so. And then as the 20th century progresses, there are rather two major frameworks in the first 50 years or so of the 20th century that dominate. There is the Freudian framework, sometimes called the psychoanalytic framework. Freud's first major work, The Interpretation of Dreams, was perfectly timed, published in 1900. Actually, it was published toward the end of 1899, but the publisher put the date 1900 on because, excitement for the new century, right, and so forth. And then competing with the Freudian interpretation is a school that comes to be called Behaviorism. Ivan Pavlov, working in Russia, in the later part of the 1800s, Thorndike, John Watson, and then later B.F. Skinner comes to represent a mature version of behaviorism as the 20th century progresses. Now, these two schools of psychology are in mortal combat with each other, and we're in mortal combat with each other still to some extent by the end of the 20th century, but these were the two major combatants in the field of psychology. And what they disagreed with each other on was, if we're going to understand the human being, where the locus of control or where the locus of causation primarily existed. One way of characterizing this is to say that the Freudians are strongly internalistic in their discipline. They will argue that if we take seriously Darwinian evolutionary theory, what evolution teaches us is that human beings come out of a long evolutionary chain, and what enabled those species and individuals that survived that long evolutionary chain was a fairly powerful set of instincts that were passed on then genetically from generation to generation. The species that we come out of is a more predatory kinds of species, so we have very strongly aggressive instincts. The sexual instinct obviously is also an important instinct necessary for the propagation of the species. And so if we want to understand the human psyche, particularly the conscious part of the psyche, we should really understand it as being primarily driven by biological forces, by instinctual forces, most of them unconscious, but that manifest themselves in the form of various kinds of conscious urges and so forth. So what we have here is a very strongly biologically driven understanding of human psychology. If we want to really understand what's going on in our conscious psychology, the conscious psychology really is a superficial phenomenon. It's driven by the unconscious phenomenon or the instinctual phenomenon. And so we need to have various techniques to get at the underlying unconscious or subconscious or even instinctual phenomena that really are driving the psychological show, so to speak. So we interpret dreams, we do free associations, we try to tap into long buried or repressed memories. And so the project then is very internalistic, trying to get back to the determinative biologically driven events that cause human psychology to be what it is. The behaviorists, by contrast, are much more externalistic in their approach to human psychology. They will argue, of course, that we are a product of a long line of evolution, but that the end result of evolution in the case of each human being is a very plastic being. That is to say, a being that still is malleable and shapeable and not preset to develop in any particular direction. And so the human psyche, whatever is going on there, is something then that is born into a world, but then is shaped and made malleable by the environmental and social conditions to which it is subjected to. So what the behaviorists will argue is that it is the environment in which we find the decisive causal and shaping forces, not so much the biological forces. That the biological package that we're born with can be shaped into just about anything depending on the environmental circumstances one is exposed to. The Freudians, by contrast, tend to deny that. They will argue that primarily the biological has its own destiny and that the environmental forces at most can tweak things in a direction here, right, or so. Now, what both of these have in common is that they are, particularly when pushed into extreme and pure versions of both of these, strongly deterministic accounts of human nature. They will argue, both of them, that what we call consciousness, the apparent self-control, self-regulation, volition, the ability to choose our own thoughts, to direct our own actions, that is largely an illusion, that really what we think, what we feel, what we do is shaped and driven by either environmental forces beyond our control or biological forces beyond our control. That consciousness is kind of flotsam to be driven by the underlying sea forces at work here. Now, this was the nature of the debate back and forth for the first part of the 20th century. Sometimes it's just cashed out as the nature versus nurture debate. Is it nature or is it nurture that is really driving the ship of the soul, so to speak? And this led many thinkers by the time we got to the middle part of the 20th century to argue that both of these deterministic accounts are too reductionistic, that they are not capable of fully explaining the human psyche and all of its complexity, including those very issues that are features rather that they want to explain away, namely consciousness as an autonomous capacity with certain self-regulatory abilities, our abilities to choose and direct our own thoughts and actions in various kinds of ways. And so what happened then by the time we get to the mid-20th century is the development of a third school, which I'm just going to broadly call a cognitivist approach to psychology, but it's an approach that is not as deterministic or reductionist as either of these two here. It will argue and agree that, of course, there are important environmental factors and, of course, biological factors as well, but nonetheless, consciousness is a distinctive causal power that has features that must be understood without being reduced to either environment or biology. Now, all of that, though, is to get ahead of our story here. What we're primarily interested in this unit is behaviorism, what made behaviorism possible as a movement, shaping significantly the development of particularly of psychology in the 20th century, and then with great applications, particularly in the field of education, which is our focus in this course here. Educational psychology and much of educational practice in the 20th century has been hugely impacted by behaviorism as a theory of human nature, hence this unit in this particular course.